Hello, everyone. So, you haven't heard from me in a while. A lot of busy things, but I decided to upload another one today because something interesting just happened, and that's the Russian invasion of the eastern part of Ukraine. So I thought I'd just give you do another one of these streaming things. I haven't really got my editing software in order, so that's why there's still a lot pretty basic these clips and these episodes. But hey, we do what we do, right? So yeah, so I will probably just discuss like some of the things that happened and then stuff that I've heard from a lot of other people, and um, kind of give my thoughts on this whole situation and why it's the way it is today, and what's the best part moving forward. I mean, this is the world strategy, so we will assume a strategic point of view within these matters. Um, so that being said, let's just delve into it and let's determine first. Let's discuss a little bit about what actually happened. So this morning, Russia invaded the eastern part of Ukraine, and not only that, they also attacked a lot of vital areas, a lot of strategic military as well as civil infrastructural points within the country with airstrikes and missile strikes. So yeah, it is pretty aggressive. It's a bit more aggressive than I anticipated, to be quite honest with you. I assumed he was going to invade the eastern part of Ukraine, and that he was probably going to do some airstrikes along some of Ukraine that's along the eastern part of the country. But I wasn't really expecting him to go straight for Kiev, Odessa, Charkov, and cities like that. But he did. And from a strategic point of view, it's not necessarily bad, but he did it. Of course, from a humanitarian point of view, it is. So let's just delve into it. So the main things that I've heard a lot of people say and talk about and like put out into the air is, all right, why doesn't NATO react militarily to this? And the quickest response to that is because Ukraine is neither a member of NATO and neither a member of the European Union. And that this is where many people get confused, because there is, of course, there are partnerships between NATO and Ukraine, and there are partnerships between the European Union and Ukraine. So it's kind of like a different perspective on the hierarchy and structural organization of NATO. So NATO has partnerships with dozens of countries throughout the world, and these are often strategic, and they often serve both the interests of NATO as well as the country, the country in which we talk about. However, that does not mean that this country is officially a NATO member. So NATO officially consists of about 30 members, 30 member states. Most of them are in Europe. Um, and the other, of course, being the United States and Canada. So this is pretty much the alliance of NATO. And a NATO member means that you are a full-fledged member of NATO. That doesn't just mean that America will come to your aid whenever you are being attacked militarily. It means that all NATO members have an obligation to come to your military aid if your autonomy is being risked, if it's being threatened by any foreign party. Now, NATO was created with the idea that the the Eastern Bloc, the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union. Well, the Soviet Union fell in 1991, and after that, it's kind of like being a global cooperation effort against war and terrorism, against regional disputes. But now, what we see a shift going back to that Soviet West versus East dynamic with this invasion of Ukraine. So the simple answer is NATO can't come to the aid of Ukraine, or is not willing to come to the aid of Ukraine, because it's not a full-fledged NATO member, so it's not obliged to. When we talk about Ukraine and NATO, we have to remember a couple of things very vividly. Look, Ukraine is a very young country. So Ukraine only founded its independence in the 90s. So that means it's only been around for, let's say, 20, 25, some fish, not even 30 years full, being independent. Before that, it was part of the Soviet Union. Now, the funny thing is that even after its independence, kind of like a revolution took place in Ukraine, as most of you will remember. Ukraine has heavily dependent on Russia, not just for military support, but also for financial support, civil infrastructure, the works. Just it was pretty much, it was an independent country, but it was very strong still under the umbrella of Russia. It had a pro-Russian government back then, and nothing, as it seemed, would make anyone believe that Ukraine would like turn to the West at a near point in time. However, after the revolution of 2014, when the government at the time was forced to flee Kiev, and a new government which was pro-Western, which acted accordingly to the temperament of the people that wanted to be closer to the West, that wanted to be integrated in the European Union, and just wanted to look forward rather than backward. The dynamic between Russia and Ukraine changed dramatically. And Putin kind of felt that, and he felt that, okay, I'm losing my influence around the border. Ukraine, which we have cared for pretty much, we have supported, which up until 20 years from 2014 was a part of the Soviet Union, was a part of what Russia represented, is now making a total turn to the opposite, and he wants to go to the West. Okay, so this is where the main problem started, and not just for Russia against Ukraine, but also within Ukraine itself, because there were a lot of pro-Russian elements still active within the country that refused to come closer to the West, that refused to be taken into the European Union, and then wanted none of it, that wanted to stay closely aligned to the East, to Russia. And then the Ukrainian civil war, as we all know, broke out. So, like, the tensions are not new. It's not a new thing. It's not a new conflict. In 2014, Russia was heavily involved with arming separatists, organizing them, helping them find some form of structure, arming them, openly supporting them through all their social channels, through all their communication channels, and just aiding them in their efforts. Because Russia has a stake, and that is that they want their border countries to be pro-Russian. They achieved this with Belarus, and they thought they achieved it with Ukraine up until 2014. And then, of course, Ukraine turned completely to the West, into the opposite direction. So that's just like a basic understanding of the short history, but also the pretty long history between Ukraine, the conflict between Ukraine and Russia right now. So where does Russia play into this? So from Russia's point of view, it's like, okay, they they felt betrayed, and they felt that whatever this new government represented, it was not the complete will of the entirety of the people of Ukraine, given the fact that there were a lot of pro-Russian separatists active, and they were willing to fight even and wage war even for their view, their perspective of staying closely aligned with Russia, and rather with Russia than with the West, for that matter. So this is in 2014. Of course, during this time, we all know Russia annexed Crimea. It made already some moves, but it didn't really push through yet. And here we are 8 years later, and as it seems, Putin is finally making a push for maybe the plan he had already had in 2014, just he wasn't really confident in executing it yet. So that brings us to another question, which we will answer later, and that is, why is Ukraine so important for Putin? But first, let me stick to the current subject, and that is why Ukraine is not a NATO member, or not even a European Union member for that matter, and why it's a different and complicated subject. So, as we see, Ukraine is not an independent country for very long. It only received independence in the 90s. And for the longest period of that independency, it still, in practice, was very dependent on Russia, in a lot of different ways. So let's say only for the past 8 years, it's a country that really more or less functions apart from Russia and is trying to get closely aligned to the West. However, what we must understand about both the European Union and NATO, for that matter, is that they are strategic partnerships. It's not a charity. Many people have this image of NATO, it's this image of the European Union that, okay, like when the poor country is being attacked, when the poor country is under assault, when the poor country is receiving some form of threat, wherever it will be, NATO will stand up, it will rise to the occasion and all to defend it. This is not what NATO represents. NATO represents a very strict partnership, which means that, of course, there are some perks in terms of defense. Of course, there's close cooperation. And of course, there is an umbrella of protection being supplied by all the NATO members. However, you also have to provide something in return. There's a certain percentage of your spending expenditure which needs to go to defense. There's a certain responsibility in terms of providing aid also to other members, doing cooperation, partaking in drills, and being ready and capable to do just that. As for the European Union, there are also some guidelines there that we need to take into consideration, more financial and economic ones, but they're still there. You need to be able to to comply with a certain standard in order to become a profitable European Union member. And in the last couple of years, we had a crisis in between. We saw the situation in Greece. We saw the situation in Spain, where the European Union had to pump an incredible amount of money in order to keep those economies standing. And when they look at Ukraine, they see a country that has been very dependent for the entirety of its independence, and hasn't really got the means, the infrastructure, or the experience in place to really create an independent economy or an independent military structure or military organization. Because even the military organization that they do have right now is still heavily influenced by Western support and very dependent on Western support. So for both NATO as well as the European Union, Ukraine is not really an attractive subject. So this is where many people think like, okay, but they need help. They need, yes, this may be, but we have to remember that when we're talking about geopolitics, it's very easy to assume everything as in the moment. But many times we forget the history, what led to the moment. So we understand why the NATO as well as the European Union were hesitant to either take Ukraine in, is because they're not really seen as profitable or viable for membership due to the standards that they now held in regard. So this is just a short answer on why NATO and the European Union hasn't pushed earlier for Ukraine to come into their organizational structure. It was planned because obviously they want the country to flourish, and obviously they see their turn to the West as a very positive thing. I mean, any turn away from Russia is a win and is an advantage for NATO. But at the moment, we have to remember the very hard situation, and that is that Ukraine is not an independent country whatsoever in practice. It never was in reality. It depended heavily on Russia, even if being integrated in the European Union, even if it was being integrated into the NATO. So we have to remember that very, very, very well, and keep that at the forefront of our minds when we discuss, okay, what did NATO do or didn't do with regards to Ukraine? Because purely practically speaking, they didn't have any obligation whatsoever towards Ukraine. Neither the European Union did and neither NATO did. Just because of the dire situation and the strategic importance of Ukraine, and NATO has an interest to a certain degree in what goes on there. And obviously, the invasion right now of Russia is a very strategic blowback to the NATO, which I will discuss very shortly. So this is the first thing that I wanted to kind of like clear up in terms of NATO, European Union, and Ukraine. Now, this brings me to my second point, and that's why is Ukraine so important for Putin. So if you like the real, I'll probably do a different video on the real complete story about why Ukraine is so important for the Russian people, and it goes all the way back to the 7th, 8th century, Kiev, the kind of like the birthplace of Russian culture, which was Kiev, not Moscow, by the way, and its close relationship with the Russian people throughout the entirety of history. As far as modern history is concerned, what makes Ukraine so important for Putin is the fact that it was one of the cornerstones of the Soviet Union. It belonged to them. It was one of them. And when the Union fell, of course, they gained their independence a couple of years later. But still, even in those times, they were pro-Russian. They were supported by Russia. They were funded by Russia. They had agreements with Russia. Everything still in practice was pro-Russian. And after 2014, this dramatically changed for the worse. Now, when we want to understand why Ukraine Ukraine is so important for Putin a little bit more. So Putin is like one of the last relics of a bygone age. He's even in Russia, he's being viewed as the last living remnant of the Soviet age, like the grand prime of the Soviet Union. I mean, he was an officer in the KGB. I mean, he worked very closely. He did a lot of high-profile work for the Soviet Union. And when the Union fell, obviously, it took a toll on him. There are tales of him working as a cab driver throughout the years in order to get by. And if you come from such a high position of status, such a high position in the government, with all the glamour and reputation that comes along with that, and you go from that and you see the fall of everything that you believed in, that will leave a mark on a man. In all honesty, it will leave a mark, and it certainly left this mark on Putin. And Putin has made small hints. This is what his ultimate ideal world would look like: a turn back to the Soviet Union, to those age, to those grandeur, and he wants to restore Russia in that glory. And that was always the image that most of the Western world had of Putin, like a dog, like a wolf laying dormant, waiting for the right time to strike. And we were right, because he was. However, as it seems now, it's gotten a little bit further than just that, and I will talk about that later. So, for Putin's eyes, Ukraine is a country that pretty much doesn't exist. Ukraine is a part of Russia, just like Belarus is a part of Russia, because he grew up with this Ukraine. This is all he knew, Ukraine ever to be. And the fall of the Soviet Union, within his eyes, of course, is illegitimate and shouldn't have happened at all. Something that came afterwards for him is also illegitimate, and it's just something he doesn't respect. In his world, it's just not the case. We in the West, we of course have grown up with this antagonistic image of Russia, of the Soviet Union, but for him, it's what like for him it's the complete opposite. For him, it's the ideal perspective of the way the world should be. So for him, it has historical reasons. He wants Ukraine from historical reasons, for cultural reasons, because in his eyes, it's part of Russia that was taken away from them illegitimately. But most of all, he wants it for strategic reasons. Like I said, Putin is a man of the Soviet Union. And in Putin's mind, we're still living in the 20th century. He never left. For him, the fall of the Soviet Union never happened. For him, Russia should still be the power it was in the times of the Soviet Union, or better even, before, when it was empire. This ideal perspective and what Russia should represent and be. So the West and everything that opposes that is the ultimate enemy in Putin's mind. It's the ultimate enemy. It's in that case, he's no different than, let's say, Iran or Iraq was in the times of Saddam Hussein. Like, the United States is the ultimate enemy, and NATO and everything that belongs to the United States, everything that's associated with the United States, is the main enemy. Now, on the north side, we have Finland, Iceland, Lithuania, and Latvia. Both of these three countries, by the way, are NATO members. Finland has very strong strategic partnerships with NATO, just as Sweden, and is eligible for full membership around 2025, which would mean that its entire northern border is full of NATO member states that are directly at his border, not in front of another country, his border. When he looks down, he's Turkey, even though he has very strong diplomatic relationships with Turkey and Erdogan. Turkey is a NATO member, which means even in the south, NATO is right at its border. Now, in the center, he has Poland, but it's being separated for a good part by Ukraine and Belarus. Belarus is loyal to Putin. With all this talk going on about Ukraine being a strategic partner of NATO and the European Union, he fears that also in the center, NATO would be right at his corner. And in his eyes, seeing that NATO is a straight up enemy of the entire Russian people and everything that stands for, this is just unacceptable. So for him, Ukraine is like a last resort. He needs to get Ukraine back on his side if he wants to keep even the notion alive of what he believes will be Russia's rightful place back into superpower supremacy. So this is just one of these reasons why he can't let Ukraine go. And he all of his efforts towards Ukraine. So for NATO, and in my opinion, this is something that NATO underestimated severely. Ukraine is also a very strategic asset, or it could be a very strategic asset. The reason, of course, that it forms, that it is aligned to the border of Russia in central position, which means that if NATO should have succeeded in getting Ukraine into its ranks, or if it wanted to anyway, it would have member states aligned at the border of Russia, north, central, and south. This is, of course, an incredibly strategic advantage, especially if you take into account that the Black Sea will then be completely controlled by member states of NATO: Ukraine, Moldova, Romania, and Turkey. So it's a very strategic asset for NATO as well. And if Russia decides to conquer Ukraine in its entirety, it will pose a lot of problems for the geographical in Europe, and also on the geopolitical scale. And this is why I think NATO kind of like underestimated, or will find out that it underestimated the dynamic and the importance of Ukraine as a strategic asset in the region. So Putin is a smart guy. Putin has prepared for this moment for a very long time. He knew he couldn't let Ukraine enter the fold with the West, become a European member state. It was just unacceptable for him. And many people will ask, okay, but why did he wait this long? Why did he didn't do it in 2014 when he annexed Crimea? Why did he do it now? The short answer to this is because he needed time. The long answer, as I will explain now, is the following. So in 2008, Russia had an armed conflict with Georgia in 2008, and it didn't go well. And many at that time were already assuming like, okay, the Russia of the old, it's no longer. I mean, even militarily, it's blundering. It's not prepared to wage one war. It has outdated equipment. It has it has an outdated organizational structure. It's not effective anymore. And many NATO members kind of looked like this and said, okay, wow, we don't have to fear. We don't have much to fear from these guys anymore, apart, of course, from the constant nuclear deterrent. But Russia also started to think, and they thought like, okay, yes, we do need to change a lot, and saw like the weaknesses and the dents in their armor, so to say. And after that, after the Russian-Georgian conflict, around 2010, 2012, Russia really started to push for a complete reorganization of their organizational structure, a complete remodeling of their their equipment that was outdated, and just was like, okay, we're going to modernize this, and we're going to modernize this properly. And they pretty much spent the last 10 years doing just that. Why didn't Putin push further in 2014? One, because Ukraine was doing a fine job on itself in destabilizing the country. There were pro-Russian separatists which pretty much did the fighting for them. Crimea, of course, was a very strategic point, which was in Russia's reach at the time to grab, and they did it, which slowly increased their influence. But at the time, Russia, in my opinion, wasn't confident enough to really make that push, even though it was in Putin's head, undoubtedly, but he wasn't quite there yet in terms of his reorganization of the military. Now we're living in 2022, we're 8 years later, and Russia has done an amazing job of reorganizing their military. 70% of their equipment was outdated, has now been replaced with much modern equipment. They've made units much more faster, much more coherent, and much more battle ready than they were in 2008 or 2014 for that matter. And over the past couple of years, he also learned to deal with the inevitable economic sanctions that he knew Europe and the United States and NATO, for that matter, would immediately impose on him. And in the future, and in the past, this really damaged Russia's economy to a certain degree, and it still does. The Russian economy is far from properly healthy, but it's been more sturdy in the last couple of years because, just like with all and with everyone, You learn through experience. And Putin needed this time. Putin needed this time to adjust, to think, to assume everything, think about, strategize. What is the European going to do? What is NATO probably going to do, apart from military support or or potential military action? And what will I need prepared for? And I think he did just that. He planned. He planned. He was patient. He was shrewd. He was strategizing, and he came up with this idea. Of, okay, now is the time, because if I don't do this now, they will go to NATO for sure, and European Union will gain them, and I will have another NATO member state on my border, and which is something that I can't allow. So Russia's more efficient militarily. Russia's better equipped militarily than it was in 2008. And this is where I think that the NATO members, and especially the United States, kind of dropped the ball in recent times. They underestimated Russia severely. They weren't actually planning properly on the what ifs of a Russian remodelization, restructure of its military, of its armed forces, of its equipment. And another thing that we need to take into account is Putin's age. Putin is around 70 right now, which means that the dream that he has, the dream that he has had ever since he went into politics, the restoration of Russian pride, so to speak, this is the time to do it. He is still able, he still has his wits about him. He's reinforced his position in Russian politics. He's remodeled his military. He's remodeled his armed forces. He's restructured his units and its military commands, and all have led to this moment. For them, this is it. This is his last push to what he pertains as this ideal image of what Russia should be, and that's a very important thing to consider, because we're dealing with psychology first. We're dealing with a man that dreams about this and maybe even lost himself in the dream. If you look at his last press conference, for example, he's talking about not just the Soviet Union, he's talking about pre 1970, before he's talking about Russia, he's talking about the times of the Tsar, he's talking about restoring that glory, during which Russia had approximately almost 1/4 of the entire known world at its disposal. It was huge. It had a huge regional control in Asia. It had half of Europe at its disposal. So yeah, it was significant. And this is what he wants. This is his ideal world. He wants to go even further than Stalin did. He wants to go even further than the Soviet Union did. He wants to go back to that time. Whether he truly thinks it will be a realistic goal, I'm not sure. Will he try to push as far of it as possible? Will he push it as far as possible, this agenda? Absolutely. And if he remains on the post, he will do a lot more. Because when we look at the recent turn of events in the last couple of months, his involvement in the unrest in Kazakhstan, for example, this is not random. Slowly gain back control in these areas that formerly belonged not only to the Soviet Union, but even before to the Russian Empire. And this is his ultimate goal. Like he wants that. He wants that back. So again, he made very good use of the already pro-Russian parts of eastern Ukraine. He made very good use of its strategic position in Belarus, and he just invaded the country with very focused, very strategic maneuvers, I would say, which really show Russia's gained experience of the last conflicts it has been engaged in, and shown their efficiency in being able to destabilize a country very quickly with a proper amount of force. And that's something to as a strategist or as a military strategist or enthusiast, something to relatively admire, to say. Of course, NATO wouldn't look at it that way. But yeah, I mean, Putin showed to fight, and the capacity to fight, and he has the capacity to fight efficiently and strategically, and that's a very big problem for NATO. So, like NATO already said that they were not going to respond militarily, so that kind of puts a lot of the subjects that I wanted to discuss in these days a little bit to rest, because I had made a couple of plans on how NATO should best counteract the threat of a Russian invasion, what they should do if Russia should invade. But we're past that now. Russia has invaded. NATO said that there will be no military action whatsoever. So that kind of like nullifies that entire situation, which means that Ukraine is strategically done. I mean, it's lost. It's just in the hands of Putin now and how far he's willing to go. Will he stay only eastwards? And are these airstrikes on the western part of the country just really for to nullify and neutralize, I'm sorry, their air force and their air capability so his forces can just do their work in the east? Or is it just a setup of a complete as well? Because he said that he wants Ukraine to be demilitarized. He wants Ukraine to pose no threat whatsoever. He wants Ukraine to be neutral, which is very interesting that he said that, because this is something that NATO could take an advantage of, in my opinion. Because a neutral Ukraine, in my opinion, would still be very, very good outcome for NATO, rather than a pro-Russian Ukraine, which is controlled by Russian troops or by a very strong pro-Russian government with a pro-Russian military. So this is something that I think NATO should immediately take advantage of these words, and like, okay, if you want to demilitarize Ukraine, we can come to terms with that. I mean, if we look at other countries in Europe, I mean, Switzerland is the perfect example. They are neutral as well, and it goes very well for them. I mean, if anything, it's the best protection that you can have as a country, being neutral in a situation like that. So maybe for Ukraine, this is the best. This is the best solution, because a very big problem for the Ukrainian people as well. A completely Western Ukraine, which is aligned with the EU and which is aligned to NATO, is a very big problem for Russia, and as it seems also for a very big amount of Ukrainian people. If it wasn't a problem, there wouldn't have been a civil war. After all, we have to remember this. It's very easy to comply with all this pro-Western propaganda, which is pretty much the same as Russian propaganda, just in a different daylight. We must remember this. Like, Ukraine is not a country which says 80-90% is pro-Western. It's very closely, almost even similar, pro-West, pro-East. And just that they have a pro-Western government now doesn't really mean that it necessarily reflects the sentiment of the majority or the entirety of the Ukrainian people. So that is something we need to remember. So a neutral Ukraine, I think that is a strategy that NATO should really, because it's better than a pro-Russian Ukraine. And if you're not going to respond militarily, listen, we're all realists here, and especially if we're talking about strategy, warfare, especially for those of us that have any understanding about Russia's military capacities in comparison to that of Ukraine, we all know that if Putin decides to go for Kiev, he will have Kiev, and it won't take months. I can guarantee you that. He will take it much faster. So this is something diplomatically that has to be pursued: demilitarization of Ukraine, a neutral Ukraine whatsoever, that might be even sponsored financially by both Russia and the West, just like, and has different interests without a certain political left or right agenda. Again, look at Switzerland. It's a very good example. Switzerland is neutral. Switzerland has kind of like this aura of untouchable, an aura of pureness about it, even for the worst and the worst dictators in the world. Russia is, or Switzerland is a safe haven, not least because of its financial system and its banking system. But yeah, this is definitely something in the worst case scenario that might be looked at, and that the Ukrainian President Zelensky might also be interested in looking in, because a war with Russia is just a war that he cannot necessarily win strategically. It will be either a complete invasion of Russia's forces, and after that it will be a war of attrition, like a guerrilla-style war, in which the Ukrainian people will have to do most of the fighting, as the military will be destroyed. So, are you willing to put your country, put your people through that, if there are other means of exploration which will mean that you will regain or maintain your independence, but you won't have necessarily like a military, an armed force that can be exploited by either Russia or the West, which is still, I think, now when I talk about it, it's actually it's a very good solution, I would say. My next point, and that's what should NATO do, or what should Russia do. First, let me talk about what should Russia do. So the Russians, in my opinion, they have a couple of options. It's mostly depends on how far they're willing to suffer economically. But again, Putin already showed throughout the last couple of years, and even though its entire term as president, that he has very little interest in the welfare of his people. He doesn't really care economically about them as long as his funds and the people closest to him are kept in check and kept relatively wealthy. So generally, sanctions against Russia will only work, in my opinion, on the long term. It won't change the situation right now on the ground in Ukraine whatsoever. But there's still some things you can do. You can opt to keep the eastern part of Ukraine, kind of maybe even push it a little bit further and create like a pro-Russian zone, or even completely annex it, just like you did with Crimea, and the regions of Luhansk, Donbass, and Donetsk part of Russia itself. Of course, there's a lot of procedure and a lot of political stuff that needs to happen before that can take place, and of course, it will be very opposed, I would say, by the rest of the world. But it's something you can do. You can kind of limit it to eastern Ukraine and just kind of take your winnings there and say, okay, at least we've gained some territorial advantage inside of Ukraine. However, in my opinion, I don't think he will stop there, because if he stops there, Ukraine will almost certainly immediately push forward to reach their goal of NATO membership, whatever the cost may be, because they've seen Russian aggression firsthand. So I think he will push further. He will push further in order to try to convince President Zelensky that the demilitarization of Ukraine is the only possible path forward if he's willing to survive. Won't respond militarily to Zelensky in that moment. Will he comply with that, or will he enter a war of attrition? Will he enter an armed conflict that can last for years and years and years, which means that these people will have to become guerrilla fighters in order to find any likelihood or any hope of survivability in the future, which is a very high price to pay. The high price for Russia is, of course, its economical assets. However, this is not the first time Russia has suffered economic sanctions throughout the world, and they've learned to manage this, and I think they're in a better position now than they were in 2014 economically. Another aspect that many people have told me is, okay, why don't we just target Putin directly? And I know that Joe Biden has already mentioned something like this. Germany already mentioned something like this today, to really put sanctions on Putin and his closest advisors and staff around him. The problem with that being is that, again, we're talking about seasoned politicians. These are people that of course, they have assets in Russia, but most of their assets will probably be in places like Switzerland or the Cayman Islands, places that are neutral in any conflict. And these assets, it's very unlikely that these assets will be targeted at all, as they're under the protection of a banking system in a neutral country. So even that, I think, will prove to have limited success in terms of changing the situation on the ground in the near future. I think Russia, and Putin in particular, is willing to go quite far economically to see this through, because I think the win and the advantage outweighs the cost for him in this regard. For him, Ukraine simply cannot have any chance of becoming a NATO member. He's not willing to suffer any more NATO expansion on his behalf and around his borders. He's made this very clear. So I think economic sanctions, I think it is enough to deterrent to push for further action. I think that's just not going to happen. So Russia has all the momentum now. I mean, Russia is on the offensive. They're the most aggressive party, and they're acting relatively unopposed. If you take apart the sanctions, can they topple Ukraine's military? Yes, easily. They can do so in a matter of days. Will it be cost efficient for them? It might be. As now we see the Ukrainian people unite. They're taking up arms, and they're already starting some form of guerrilla warfare, which will probably last for years and years and years if Putin really decides to make a complete push for Ukraine. But as far as their military goes, I think the Ukrainian military has the potential of falling in a matter of days if Russia really decides on a full-scale invasion. It has all the strategical advantages in the Black Sea. It has all the strategical advantages in the north. So this is some of these options that Russia or Putin might decide. Are we going to limit to the east only, and kind of like de-escalate the situation even, in the hopes that sanctions won't be as harsh as is being talked about right now, or do we don't leave anything to chance and just push for the entirety of Ukraine, either to conquer it in its entirety or to neutralize its military assets to such a degree that demilitarization of Ukraine is the only option, viable option left. And I think if I was in Putin's shoes, I would probably opt for the latter, complete demilitarization of Ukraine. So what should NATO do in this case? Well, as I already said, like demilitarization of Ukraine and the prospect of a neutral Ukraine might not be so bad after all. I mean, it certainly is better than but like I said, NATO already decided not to act militarily, so there's very limited things that NATO or the European Union can do about the situation. It's pretty much right now all about how far is Putin willing to go, how far is Putin willing to push, and it will stop at that. However, if we monitor Putin closely and we take heed of his words, and we can try to kind of like take advantage of that in a diplomatic way and say, okay, you're talking about the demilitarization of Ukraine. What are the conditions that are in your mind right now about that? How can we make that happen if it means stopping further escalation of this conflict and stopping your forces from invading further into Ukraine? So it's a viable option diplomatically, absolutely. As for NATO, I don't think that you should look too much about Ukraine right now. I think that you should look to the long term, in terms of strategic deterrence, and like, okay, how to prepare a threat that we thought was no longer here, but is still very viable today. If I was NATO, of course, the first couple of things that I would consider apart from Ukraine is focus on the Nordic states of Sweden and Finland. For me, these are very important because they also closely aligned with Russia. They're also at the border and they're directly above Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, which are also NATO member states. So if NATO will succeed in getting Sweden as well as Finland as complete NATO members under their membership, this will be a huge strategic advantage for them because it means you control the entirety of the Russian border with 5 NATO members, and if you take Poland into account, 6. So it will dramatically increase your front. You should remodel and really think about, okay, what will happen if push further than how is the defense of Moldova, Romania, how is the defense of Poland, Czechoslovakia, the Czech Republic, and how can we protect our assets there? NATO should really think about, okay, we're going, what we thought was a bygone age, we're going back to the age of conventional warfare, where 2 very powerful entities are against each other. So strategic thinking in this regard and conventional military strategy will kind of make a return to the fold. And we should embrace that and now rather than later, because if Putin gets Ukraine and he comes with it, and he comes away with it relatively unscathed, I don't think it will deter him from pushing for further action. Rather, I think it will motivate him. Now, I don't think that he will push for a NATO member state in Europe. I don't think he's to say the least. It would be disastrous, and I don't think he's that stupid. I think he's much more shrewd and much more strategic than people give him credit for. Now, what I think that he will do, however, is focus his attention on Central Asia and kind of increase his influence there. Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, kind of like the Central Asian states, I think is where he will put his focus on next, and the hopes of increasing his territorial control there, but also creating stronger diplomatic ties with countries such as Iraq, Syria, Iran, China, and North Korea. Because if there's one strategic disadvantage that Russia has right now is the lack of allies, so to speak. So this is something that I think he will do, rather than after Ukraine, rather than focusing too much on European control. For him, Ukraine is a very symbolic operation. It gives him a much higher influence in the Black Sea and in the nations around it. It gives him a lot of access to Ukrainian soil and all the rich uh, um, um, minerals and uranium, titanium, everything that's in the country. Um, it's also a symbolic act of defiance towards the United States and everything that it stands for. For him, it's a retaliation on the humiliation that he felt inside himself all those years after the fall of the Soviet Union, and the disrespect he felt for the Ukrainian people after 2014 when they wanted to turn to the Western Hemisphere in terms of political ambition. So this is what I think that he should or he will do after Ukraine. Now, a lot of people that also say, "Where's China in all this? Are they supporting Putin?" Some say yes, some say no. The reality is they don't support him, and and they do like they support him politically in terms of they don't challenge him. And I think that's the best way to put it. China understands that it's just like Russia, very isolated. China also understands that um, performing acts of naked aggression will kind of have a way of isolating you even more. China doesn't want this. China is not interested in the Soviet Union. China is not interested in the Russian Empire. China isn't interested in the history of, let's say, the last 2,000 years, because quite frankly, it wasn't as interesting for them. In recent history, up until maybe the last century, China has been a relatively weak, vulnerable, and poor country, which only changed in the last couple of decades when it became more and more of a military regional power. And now, of course, it's among the top five strongest nations in the world. So China is looking forward rather than backwards. Although China, just as Russia, is very shrewd, and they also know that they have to play the game very um, patiently and very carefully. So they don't oppose Russia, but they also don't challenge them. They will keep their economic agreements with them. They will pursue. They will even support one another economically and financially. But militarily, you don't have much to fear in terms of a Russian Chinese cooperation, just like, let's say, the NATO has or the European Union has. It's totally different, and China will never get sucked into that. I think they're much more clever than that, and they're much more progressively orientated. However, they do play their cards very close to the chest, and will look at this and say, okay, well, how will the world respond? Because there's another country or another state that has recently has a struggle for independence, which is the state of Taiwan, which is looking with great interest to this situation. Will probably look and see, okay, what will the world do in such a situation? What will the effect of the sanctions be on a power such as Russia or such as ourselves if we would in the future invade Taiwan? So China is playing truth. China is playing very close to the chest, and it is what it is. But I don't. China is a minor party in this entire conflict, and shouldn't be discussed too much. What they will do, however, is support Russia economically to a certain degree, which might nullify some of the effects of the economic sanctions being put on them by various countries around the world. But other than that, strategically, it's not worth mentioning. So this is right now where the situation stands, in my opinion. It will be very interesting to see how the situation develops in the near future and the coming days. What will happen? I might do a couple other videos on some certain specialized subjects or some subjects to really delve into, okay, what is this problem? Where does it come from? I don't want to do this right now because it will be too general. And it will be too long of a video, I'm afraid. So this is my view on this current situation in Ukraine. In short, NATO should definitely push for a diplomatic solution if it's possible, a demilitarization of Ukraine, a neutral Ukraine, on the pretext that it's truly neutral, not pro-Russian, should be an opportunity definitely that you want to pursue. And in the long term, it's about strengthening, especially the states around the border of Russia, Sweden, Finland in particular, really reinforcing your northern front and remodeling your structure against a conventional military threat by a nuclear power. Um, as far as Russia is considered, it's all in the hands of Putin pretty much. How far are you willing to go, and does the cost of a neutral Ukraine or a pro-Russian Ukraine outweighs the damage that you will suffer economically? And it will kind of be that question that they will then need to ask themselves, as far as strategy go, and if Putin is really serious about his non-tolerance regarding Ukraine as a NATO member or as a European Union member in the future, then probably taking just the east won't be enough as the rest of Ukraine, even when it will separate in some scenario from Luhansk, Donbass, and Donetsk. Um, it will still be unacceptable for Putin. So I think according to Putin's mindset and his perspective, his best bet is to push forward. Either take the entirety of Ukraine, force a guerrilla war, a war of attrition, uh, or opt for demilitarization of Ukraine by sheer military pressure. I think multiple for the people of Ukraine, I really hope it remains in the east. Um, but again, I don't think it will, because if it just only remains in the east, Ukraine will most certainly opt for immediate closer relationships with the NATO, with the European Union, and will most certainly discuss rapid possibilities of them being integrated in their organization under their membership umbrella. And as Putin has said before, this is just something that he doesn't want to accept. So this is just my compilation, pretty much, of my thoughts on the subject. I mean, it's crazy. But we are the world of strategy, so we are obliged to kind of like look at this problem from multiple angles, from multiple strategic points of view, and kind of like determine the possibilities. So all of these are potential scenarios that I just discussed. If you have comments or if you want to know more about a certain subject, write it down below. Write me directly. I don't know if there are any contact information on the channel. I think it is. Um, and I will see if I can do a video about it or if I can answer you. This was all for today. Thank you very much. Bye bye.